Natasha, it's great to see you today.
Thanks for having me.
Professor, you look at authoritarian regimes, and at the University of Essex, you study how they function and how they also decline and fall. So, when you look at the Putin regime, what is it that you see?
So I think in the case of Putin in Russia, he doesn't have complete control over the situation. There are things that are not going well. There are signs that things aren't going well. The war didn't go exactly as planned. There are economic hardships that are experienced by many people in Russia. And though they weathered a lot of the impact of the sanctions, these sanctions aren't going to go away. And Russia hasn't really even had a chance to generate much economic growth since the sanctions that were employed in 2014. He is systematically going after those that threaten his power with the purges that happened with senior levels of the military. He's lost many generals in this conflict. That he clearly underestimated the resolve of the Ukrainian people. So there are a lot of points of instability, of insecurity here for Putin. I think the biggest test he probably did weather, but it will really be a matter of whether or not he can maintain the satisfaction and happiness of those that surround him, those elites that surround him in the security institutions, and he has to ensure that they are in line with his worldview and that they remain loyal to him. And it really just could only need one to turn on him. And you might see a lot of pressure coming from other people within the regime that decide that the writing is on the wall. I don't think it's happening as of yet, but I think this recent Ukrainian incursion into Kursk is really interesting to see if there's going to be more of a backlash to that. And if Ukraine is able to capitalize on that and um, do something else inside Russia that is successful, that all poses a challenge to Putin's regime.
So, when you look back at the record, someone like Putin, what should be afraid of? What typically takes down a dictatorship? Is it popular protests in the streets, or is it something like a coup plotter? What's likely to be the end of a dictator?
By far the biggest threat to any authoritarian regime is it's not the people, it's not that there's going to be a revolution. Revolutions do happen. They're happening a bit more frequently today than they were in the past, but revolutions are actually really rare. What is more likely to happen is that there's going to be a coup or there's going to be an ouster led by political or military elites. By far, the biggest threat to any dictatorship are the elites that surround him or her. And so, what you can see with the case of Putin, there are rumblings of instability. Of course, there are people that are unhappy. It's hard to gauge just to what extent, but the most likely pathway of ousting Putin from power would be someone within his inner circle or someone from the military.
So, really, those who are trying to create change in Russia, who are just hoping that the average person is going to rise up, probably have misplaced hopes. The reality is that somebody closer to Putin in his inner circle or in the upper elites of the military might be the ones who are likely to try to overthrow the Putin regime. Is that true?
That's right. The biggest threat to Putin's regime is someone in his inner circle or someone from the military. Now, that doesn't mean that the public plays no role here. If there's a lot of unrest, if there's a lot of protest, if the masses are rising and clearly they are frustrated and angry, that can help the calculations of a member of the military or a member of the elite in their decision making. That can give them confidence that the decision that they're about to do is going to be popular. But it's rare that it's just a people led revolution without some kind of role played by someone in the security institutions.
So, last year, you saw that Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, traveled into Russia to Rostov and what many people thought was going to be a ride all the way to Moscow. Now, when he got to Rostov, I found it to be really interesting that one, the local population of Russia greeted him. They didn't tell him to leave. Rather, they brought food, they brought wine, they brought water to all to celebrate his arrival. But even more importantly, perhaps, was that the Russian military officers who encountered Prigozhin sat outside, drank coffee, and talked with him for hours. They could have, if they'd wished to, ordered an airstrike on him or tried to arrest him, but they didn't. They just complained that perhaps he had made the wrong decision, but nobody really stood up to him. What do you make of these two elements? The Russian people themselves not doing anything, but also the Russian military showing that they're perhaps unsure what next will come of Prigozhin.
I mean, this was such a fascinating case of what happened with Prigozhin. I think there's a couple things that we can read from this. I mean, one is that Putin's popularity is very difficult to really understand. How popular is he really? How much do people really love him? And are there other people that are also, charismatic, popular figures? And clearly, Prigozhin was someone who had captivated the attention of much of the Russian public, of at least some of the Russian public, and the military. And so that created a lot of uncertainty about what they should do next. You gave the example of the military not, deciding to just get rid of him and basically having coffee with him. I mean, that just illustrates that the military had a great deal of uncertainty about like what they should do. Would it be a huge risk to take on by going after Prigozhin? Would they be better off really just kind of doing nothing, which is basically what they decided to do? And so in Russia, where it's very difficult to gauge what people are actually thinking, this is very typical of authoritarian regimes. You'll have pockets of support for other figures, and you'll also have some evidence here and there that there's not as strong a support as some of the polls would indicate for Putin.
So, for a long time, I've had a hypothesis that I wanted to ask you about. Now, imagine somebody like Prigozhin were to ride into Russia and get all the way to Moscow, and he were to say that he had taken control of the country. Now, what might happen next to anyone who tries to overthrow a government via a coup, organized with other elements, let's say, of the military? What risk does the coup plotter, now leader of a country, uh, what risk does he face, and what's necessary for him to gain legitimacy?
So this is probably the most dangerous period for any country when there is a potential coup, when it's not clear whether the coup has been successful. And we measure coups by if they last under a week. So a successful coup usually should just take a matter of days. And in those upcoming days, while they're trying to figure out what's going on, there's a lot of things that need to go in the way of the coup plotter. The military has to make a decision. And of course, the military is not sort of like a monolithic entity. There are a lot of different elements in the military, but they have to make a decision whether or not they're going to side with the coup plotter, whether that is a better risk to take, because whatever decision they make, if they make the wrong decision, they know that they're going to be punished, that this isn't going to be a situation where they're just going to get off by making the wrong decision. So they have to kind of figure out if there's critical numbers that are going to support Prigozhin, let's say, in this instance. And then at that point, Prigozhin's got to get control over all the communication systems so he can clearly communicate through the radio, television, that he is in charge. And then you have to lay out what the next steps are going to be. But the critical thing in any overthrow of a leader is getting the security institutions, the military and the police, the intelligence services, all on board with what's happening. Without it, then you could have a counter coup situation that then you end up seeing the coup fail.
So, what's the most important thing for a coup to succeed?
I mean, the most important thing for a coup to succeed is all of the security institutions need to be on board, or a majority of it needs to be in support of the coup, because that's where the danger is for the coup plotters, that some elements of the military, whether they're counterintelligence that are in the military that are there to thwart coups or undermine coups or alert the leader of a coup, they have to decide, you know what, we give up, we're going to be on the side of the coup plotters. If as long as that happens, then there's very little that the leader can do. The leader then suddenly becomes isolated. They may have like a presidential guard, some sort of like bodyguards, but that's basically it. They if they have lost the trust and respect of some of these key elements of the security institutions, then that's what makes for a successful coup.
So, looking ahead, when you see all the different dictatorships around the world, what commonalities do you see in the rise of dictatorships over the past few decades? Or what's changed in them from the decades ago, for instance, during the Cold War and the dictatorships that existed then?
The biggest change in dictatorships in the way they rise to power is that they've been rising to power through elections and not through stagey coups. So we've seen a dip in the number of coups and a rise in these autocrats that are ruling electoral authoritarian regimes. They rise to power through some kind of election. Sometimes it is free and fair. Sometimes it's not so free and fair. And then they systematically start to go after the institutions and personalize power in their hands. We are seeing that dictators are not as brutal, or at least overtly brutal, as they were in the past. Comparing Putin to Mao or Stalin, you'd have to make the argument that Putin is nowhere near as brutal as either Mao or Stalin. But you have dictatorships drawing from playbooks of the past, using propaganda, trying to gain legitimacy, trying to engage in mind control, and getting enough people to support them. And that's been sort of an interesting turn of dictatorships, that they seem to really care about being, quote unquote, popular to some extent, or at least the facade of popularity. And that's why they go through the motions of holding elections. I mean, there were not as many dictatorships that held elections in the past. Today, very, very few countries, just a handful of countries, don't hold elections. So what we're seeing today are these dictatorships that are, trying to use the institutions of democracy, turn them on their heads, and use them to prolong their own survival.
And why do dictators need to go through the show of democracy? If the election results are going to show that they won, 99% of the vote, everyone understands it was a fraud. But why do they still go through with this?
I mean, it's a great question of why are dictatorships holding elections? Elections are actually a little bit risky for them. It means that they do have to engage in some kind of electoral misconduct or malpractice in order to ensure these victories of often 80% or more. There are more election observers there, but they think that it gives them legitimacy. They think it gives them legitimacy internationally, and they think it gives them legitimacy domestically. And by doing so, this means that they don't have to use repression as much. And they fear that if they use too much repression or use indiscriminate repression, then that's going to lead to a backlash. And then that could be unstable or cause instability for their own goals. So they're holding elections in spite of the fact that they're clearly fraudulent and that they obviously cheated.
So that raises another question. If you look back at different times the dictatorship has fallen after mass protests, for instance, 2010 in Kyrgyzstan or in 2014 in the Maidan in Ukraine, in both cases, they had fraudulent elections with large voter participation, and the dictatorship wasn't able to pull it off. But one thing that I think they had in common was that the government used violence against the population in both cases, but not in sufficient numbers. That is to say, that they shot dozens of people or even hundreds of people. But it was not tens of thousands where people feared to continue protesting. Rather, shooting at the unarmed civilians might have further radicalized and further prompted people to continue participating in the attempt to get rid of the dictator. Does that make sense? What do you think?
No, it's actually a really important point of when do dictatorships fall after a fraudulent election. I mean, that's actually a critical event, either a very severe economic crisis or a fraudulent election. It's a trigger for protests. And then the dictatorship or semi-authoritarian regime has a choice to make. Do they use a lot of repression? And that's what they've done in the case of Iran. They have just absolutely repressed, killed many, many people in these protests with just absolute reckless abandon, no care about whether or not what the optics look like. Or do you kill some people? And if you don't kill enough people, then that's not a big enough deterrence. And that's what you see happening in those cases of Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan that you mentioned, that the regime tried to respond with some repression, but not enough to deter. And instead, it backfired and it galvanized more and more people to mobilize against the regime.
So, what tip would you give to a dictator who's facing mounting crowds, aside from giving up and fleeing? What is most likely to predict whether or not he's able to survive mass protests or he fails to survive? What commonalities are there?
Number one thing, he has to make sure that the security institutions are on his side, because he's basically asking his military, his police, whoever he's using on the protesters, to kill their own people. Sometimes he uses mercenaries or expats, people from other countries, but he's asking people to do something that might be uncomfortable. And so that group of people that's being asked to repress, they need to be kept happy. They need to be given a lot of financial incentives to maintain, this type of to engage in this type of repression against their own people, and they need to be given access to really lucrative opportunities. And we see that that's what's happened in the case of Iran. And this is a regime that is incredibly unpopular, has all kinds of sources of instability. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the security institutions are well fed. They're kept, they're well taken care of. They're given access to some of the most lucrative economic opportunities in a country that is, failing economically day by day. And so that's what helps maintain the loyalty. We see in other countries, like in Bahrain, which was facing an uprising after the Arab Spring, the vast majority of the military personnel that were repressing the people were expats. They were people from from other countries. So they're willing to do that because they didn't care so much about killing people from another country, but also because their own security, their own position, being an expat, was a little bit more precarious.
So if you tomorrow were talking to people in countries that are living under dictatorships, whether it's the Russians or the Iranians or Venezuelans, and it looks like it's sort of hopeless. Those dictatorships have been there for a long time, and they're statistically more likely to stick around than not stick around. What advice would you offer them? Is there a reason to hope? And what should they be hoping for? Or what signs should they be looking for that their plot in life might be getting better?
So once an authoritarian regime has become really, really authoritarian, where they've really centralized power in the hands of a dictatorship, it does become incredibly difficult to make any kind of inroads towards ousting that person from power. But anything can happen at any point in time. And so I would advise people to not boycott elections, to participate in elections, to see if you can get a small victory here and there. And we've seen small victories in the case of Turkey under Erdogan, which is a country that's increasingly centralized power into his own hands. But there have been victories with the mayor of Istanbul going to the opposition party. So not participating in elections would be a big mistake. Also, by participating in the election, that gives the opposition a chance to organize, a chance to participate, a chance to engage in, electoral politics, to help their connections with voters. Sometimes that is almost impossible because all the opposition members are in prison, and it's really only token opposition that are there. But I would always encourage civil society and the opposition to keep taking part, to keep trying to spread accurate information about what is going on. And you never know, something could happen where suddenly someone takes on a huge risk and decides to oust the leader. Then what you want to be as part of the opposition is ready to mobilize into action an effective party that can help with the transition into democracy. But I mean, the chances of this are always incredibly low. But because it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen, you do want to have some kind of organization there that's ready to go.
Excellent. Professor, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.